Thank you very much. Good morning, honored guests. It is a true privilege for me to be with you today at the 2024 Hong Kong Green Finance Association Annual Forum. I want to especially thank Dr. Ma, a true leader in sustainable finance, for bringing us all together today, and congratulate him on the enormous success of HKGFA. As we gather to discuss how to finance the net zero transition in Asia, I thought I'd share some reflections on the state of global climate finance, including actions that financial institutions, companies, and policymakers are taking to address the risks and opportunities associated with climate change. In doing so, I will draw upon the work of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, of which I am vice chair, working alongside our co-chairs, Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney. Sustainability and climate change have climbed to the top of the global corporate agenda. To understand why, we need only look around us. Much of Asia has suffered record-breaking heat waves and rainfall. Last year, Hong Kong saw the worst flooding since record-keeping began. For the first time ever, global surface air temperatures hit an annual average of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and intensity across the globe. In response, governments representing over 90% of global emissions now have net zero commitments and are increasingly putting in place policies to back up those commitments. That creates meaningful risk for those companies that do not account for the transition in their business strategies. It also generates significant business opportunities for those companies ready to offer the products and services the world needs to turn the tide on climate change. In recognition of these risks and opportunities, many financial institutions and companies are making climate commitments and developing transition plans. These are important steps, but more work remains to fully leverage the resources and expertise of the private sector in the fight against climate change. At GFANZ, we think of the challenges in front of us as comprising 3 gaps that we need to close. First, we must close the data gap. High-quality data is the foundation of business decision-making. I led the Secretariat for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which developed a voluntary framework for climate-related financial disclosure. Those efforts were driven by the private sector, with financial institutions, including many of those represented in the room today, taking the lead in disclosing comparable and decision-useful information across jurisdictions. Through the International Sustainability Standards Board's disclosure standard, the TCFD recommendations are now becoming enshrined in law across many jurisdictions. It is critical for regulators in those jurisdictions which intend to mandate disclosure, including in Hong Kong and mainland China, to follow through on timely implementation, ensuring alignment with ISSB wherever possible. We also need to ensure that once data is disclosed, it is easily accessible and free of charge to a broad variety of stakeholders. An important effort in that regard is the development of the Net Zero Data Public Utility, or NZDPU, which was announced by Mike Bloomberg and French President Emmanuel Macron in 2022. The NZDPU will be a centralized source of transition data for major global companies. The data will include scopes 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, the targets for reducing emissions, and the use of carbon credits. Ultimately, the NZDPU will help ensure that governments, civil society, and the market have the information necessary to make informed decisions. The second gap we need to close is the action gap. Governments, companies, and financial institutions are setting out climate commitments and targets in increasing numbers, but commitments only mean something if they're dutifully implemented. At GFANZ, we're working to support our roughly 700 financial institution members by developing the tools and frameworks needed to implement their commitments. In 2022, GFANZ published a framework for net zero transition planning, which can be used by financial institutions and corporates. This pan-sector, industry-led work product set out a principles-based approach on how a net zero commitment can be translated into specific actions, metrics, and government mechanisms. The GFANZ framework identifies 10 components of a comprehensive and credible transition plan, grouped into 5 themes. The first, of course, is governance, or ensuring there is accountability, incentives, and proper training for meeting the objectives of the transition plan at all levels of an organization. The second is objectives and priority setting, or translating a long-term commitment into specific targets and establishing a high-level strategy to achieve them. Third is implementation strategy, focusing on how to work across the business to align products and services, decision-making processes, and organization-wide policies with transition objectives. Fourth is engagement strategy, focusing on how to align engagement with the public sector, industry peers, and client and portfolio companies with the transition plan objectives. And finally, fifth is metrics and targets, or how to measure progress. Through this framework, financial institutions, as well as the companies they lend to and invest in, can develop robust approaches to implementing their climate commitments, and thus manage the risks and opportunities of the climate transition. Having this industry-led common framework is essential to reducing market fragmentation and supporting relevant policies by governments. However, the GFANZ framework recognizes also that every institution needs to define its own path based on its unique business model, client base, and regulatory environment. We are seeing increased interest in transition planning by policymakers around the world, including authorities in Hong Kong, the United States, and the UK, who have all directly referenced GFANZ's work. Other jurisdictions are additionally working on transition plan policies, including the European Union, Singapore, and Japan. The ISSB's announcement that it will begin work to support the disclosure of firm transition plans under IFRS S2 builds on GFANZ's transition planning framework and is a very welcome step forward. A critical element of financial institution transition planning is defining how one's financing activities support the transition. At GFANZ, we firmly believe that we cannot get to net zero by only financing pure green activities, nor can we get there by simply divesting from high-emitting companies and activities. Rather, we need to get finance to where the emissions are in order to get them down. Transition planning and developing financing strategies to implement those plans are highly influenced by regional and local dynamics. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to this work. That's one reason why earlier this week we launched our GFANZ Hong Kong chapter with the support of Mr. Eddie Yu and Dr. Ma Jun as senior advisors. The chapter will facilitate knowledge exchange and the development of best practices for the rapid scaling of transition finance in Hong Kong, Asia, and globally, bringing GFANZ's work to the region and tailoring it to Hong Kong's context. Through the chapter, GFANZ will collaborate with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority by providing technical support on operationalizing transition finance strategies, including building out guidance for specific sectors. GFANZ is also a founding member of the Global Capacity Building Coalition, which was launched at COP28 and aims to maximize the accessibility, inclusivity, and provision of climate finance-related technical assistance, training, knowledge sharing, and research. This is made possible by an unprecedented collaboration of multilateral development banks, United Nations agencies, the ISSB, and industry bodies. The coalition enables enhanced collaboration and elevates the work of already impactful organizations. And that is why I'm so delighted that the Hong Kong Green Finance Association and CASI will join the World Bank, the IMF, GFANZ, and others as members of the Global Capacity Building Coalition. In turn, GFANZ will also become a knowledge partner of CASI, and this will help to provide an integrated, accessible support on sustainable finance topics for financial institutions in Hong Kong, building institutional capacity on transition planning and transition finance, and helping to ensure that financial professionals can access the support they need to scale climate-aligned finance. With high-quality data, the implementation of credible transition plans, and the capacity to accelerate transition finance, financial institutions can help to address the last of the three gaps, the investment gap. To get to net zero, we need to mobilize capital in the trillions of dollars across the economy and through every form of finance, public, private, domestic, and international. And there are reasons to be optimistic. Over the past 2 decades, wind and solar have been the fastest growing sources of electricity in history. Global clean energy investment has grown over 40% since just 2020 and is now around double the level of fossil fuel investment. This pace must be sustained so that clean energy investment reaches $4.5 trillion a year in the 2030s. We are reaching an inflection point on clean energy and green finance, but if the world is to get to net zero, we also urgently need to direct transition finance to heavy emitting sectors to decarbonize them. Perhaps nowhere is this more pertinent than in Asia, with rising energy demand and industries that are critical to enabling the transition. Scaling transition finance will create jobs and increase economic growth, as well as cut emissions. The International Energy Agency estimates that 10% of global GDP growth in 2023 was associated with investing in the energy transition. We also urgently need to focus on the early retirement of high-emitting assets like coal-fired power plants. At GFANZ, we are working with partners around the world on approaches to financing forward-looking coal phase-out strategies. What happens in this region will be critical to whether the world limits warming to 1.5 degrees. As the strategic gateway between Asia's growing economies and global markets, Hong Kong and its financial institutions are incredibly well positioned to lead in seizing the opportunities of the climate transition. Building on its strengths in the green bond market and leadership in green finance, Hong Kong can lead the way in showing that climate action and transition finance will go hand in hand with more jobs, more resilient cities and infrastructure, and sustainable growth. Addressing climate change is the challenge that sits at the very heart of our future prosperity. Finance cannot alone solve this challenge, but by ensuring that we have a financial system that supports transparent data, action through transition plans, and increasing climate-aligned investment, we can ensure that finance is an enabler for the transition and not a barrier to it. GFANZ stands ready in Hong Kong, Asia, and globally to engage with you on transition finance and transition planning, and to foster the dialogue that is so critical to driving forward progress on net zero. I am heartened to see such a dynamic program at the forum today. You all play a critical role in driving forward solutions to our shared challenges. It is my hope that the experiences and learnings from the forum will help you drive further progress. Thank you.
I want to really thank Dr. Ma Jun, the president and chair of HKGFA, for inviting me to your audience. I could not make it physically, unfortunately, so I'm really happy that I can connect with you as you are starting your work today. I'm Emmanuel Faber. I'm the chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board at the IFRS Foundation. And I'm delighted that I can spend a bit of time to first and foremost update you on our work, which I know sustainability-related disclosure is one of the 5 working groups here. Second, speak a little bit about why what you do is critical and how Asia is, of course, absolutely fundamental for the overall transition agenda. And finally, maybe a few words about how we work together and how we can support. So let me start by saying that we started in 2022. We issued our first standards, IFRS S1, IFRS S2 in June 23. In July 23, we were endorsed by the IOSCO, who called for jurisdiction members of IOSCO to adopt or otherwise use our standards. 9 months later, in May, we were able to announce at IOSCO's annual meeting in Athens this year that more than 20 jurisdictions across the world, from south, north, east, and west, big and small, G20 and way beyond, had already committed to a pathway to adopt or use our standards. Those jurisdictions are incredibly rich in their diversity, but also powerful in what they represent. They represent more than 50% of global emissions and 50% of global GDP already. So this is a very impressive momentum, and we both feel humbled and happy that our work can be used efficiently by capital market regulators. We issued a jurisdictional adoption guide, which has been also built with a number of jurisdictions, input and IOSCO's review, of course, at the same meeting on the 28th of May, which is now serving as a guide for jurisdictions when they want to enter into this pathway, to find the various steps from policy rational cost and benefit analysis process, setting up a standard setting organization, the consultation processes, and then implementation through their various remits, whether this is regulation, market regulation, supervision, or listing rules, for instance. 2 points I would add to this is, first, we reached a very high level of interoperability with the 2 existing initiatives at the time we started in 22, the European initiative of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS, which we have issued in May as well, a critical, simple navigation tool that allows all reporters out of Europe to start with ISSB and add what they need to be compliant with the CSRD in Europe, and conversely, for European companies or overall ESRS reporters to filter what is material in an ISSB report for investors' needs. The same, in a way, applies for the SEC, which has issued a climate rule, which is currently under review, which is essentially can be seen as a subset of our own standards, referring to TCFD, referring to the same financial materiality, to the same definitions of scopes, even though they probably, do not require scope 3 in their climate rule at this stage. I would add that we have further ensured interoperability with other existing standards, such as GRI, which we have now a very strong co-standard setting activity program, whereby we will deliver our next agenda of work in full interoperability with GRI. And I know in Asia in particular, this is an important topic because many large companies report using the GRI standards already. And the other one is CDP, for which we have a very significant agreement. And now already in the CDP questionnaire for 2024, the backbone of that questionnaire is our IFRS S2. So if you are done with IFRS S2, you are already compliant with the CDP climate disclosure. In the future, we've added a few important things. One is greenhouse gas protocol, in which we are now part as an observer of their governance, and there is a mechanism that will mean that greenhouse gas protocol changes will be reviewed by the IFRS Foundation, so as to ensure that for all those jurisdictions and preparers that are using the climate standards of IFRS Foundation, the greenhouse gas protocol is also moving in the right direction and in conjunction with that. Another important one for the future is the Task Force for Nature related financial disclosures, with whom we are working on their recommendations to import into the next agenda of our work, which is now about the biodiversity and nature agenda, the human capital, and the enhancement of the SASB standards. Finally, let me add on this rich update of our work that we have been supported in thinking about transition planning. And of course, I know how important this is for your forum. We have seen IOSCO with a project on transition plans, the Financial Stability Board, of course, on the other side, a number of jurisdictions, including Europe, starting their own journey about disclosures about transition planning. And so we have now taken responsibility for the disclosure work on transition plan of the UK TPT, which is initiated in the GFANZ work to start with, so that they will not work anymore on disclosures. These disclosures on transition plans are now hosted on our Knowledge Hub, and over time, we will create educational material building from S2 with more granular approach on how the global baseline should actually process disclosures about transition plans for those companies or organizations that do have a transition plan. Second part that I wanted to share with you is how critical your work is. And of course, you're better placed than me to say that Asia is critical in this global sustainable agenda for renewed and more resilient macroeconomics. Asia is the fastest growing region in the world. It is also more than 50% of global emissions. And so your work is critical. I have to say, I'm really impressed by the leadership that a number of jurisdictions in Asia, from north to south, with Japan, Korea, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, very soon Indonesia, but of course Australia as well, have been at the forefront of the early adopters of the ISSB. China very forcefully, mainland China came out end of May with a declaration that the Chinese standards will be basically converging and based on the international sustainability standards, adding and showing unique Chinese characteristics, of course. And of course, I have to last but not least, but with Hong Kong. Very impressed that Hong Kong was actually the first. Even before we finalized our standards, Hong Kong had started a consultation process about adopting those standards. And I would like to really commend the regulators and market authorities in Hong Kong for the incredibly rich and open dialogue that we have been able to have in Hong Kong in order to listen from Hong Kong early experience, but also to ensure that together Hong Kong was as close as possible aligned with the global baseline work that we were building as they were building their own thinking. And so certainly a very special place to address today for me in Hong Kong. I think in a way Asia has this role that that it took in about 20 years ago when the IFRS started. Hong Kong and Australia together started the IFRS champions, announced in 2002 and adopted in 2005 at the same moment where the EU adopted the IFRS accounting standards. And so in many ways, that was the kickoff, and I can feel how much Asia today is again at the kickoff of this very important language that will support the important work that your forum is addressing. I'm also acutely aware, I would say, about some of the specific challenges of Asia. I lived in China for 4 years. I worked a lot in Asia, from again south to north, east to west of Asia, and I know the challenges of the microeconomics in the region, the number of SMEs, informal economy, the length and complexity of the supply chain, and how Asia is at the core of global complex supply chains, of course. And we have had a number of conversations, of course, about Scope 3 and how to build the Scope 3 on greenhouse gas emissions, which is critical when material for transition and for resilient business models. But that also comes potentially with challenges when you need to calculate that on the basis of a myriad of small companies. And I have to say that, and maybe that will lead me to the third part, we are extremely aware of those issues at ISSB. First and foremost, I would say we have created proportionality and scalability patterns in our standards that ensure that SMEs and smaller entities that could apply the standards would not be submitted to undue costs or efforts and would act in a manner which is commensurate with their circumstances. We are insisting on a number of relief for small companies, but also transition reliefs that we have introduced in the standards in order to ensure that there could be a smooth ecosystem transition in economies that use our standards. The second thing I would say is that we deeply connect with capacity building needs. We've elected to have a particular capacity building organization, which is chaired in our organization by the second vice chair of ISSB, Jin Donghua, who is a Chinese citizen, who has been the treasurer of the World Bank and so knows a lot about the need for developing economies. And I would like to say, and cite a few of our partners. We partner with multi-lateral development banks, and that includes Asian development banks and AIIB in the region. We also partner with capacity building organization, and I want to cite Dr. Majun's initiatives of the Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainability, Sustainable Investments, of which we are knowledge partners, and we co-host and organize events in the region in Asia to discuss the progress and the challenges. And finally, I would say, I think Asia and our presence in particular in Beijing with our office there can really serve as a hub of knowledge building on how to incorporate and include SMEs as part of this global reporting system that is so critical that we build together. And so I hope that in the next, not too distant future, we will be able to bring more news on innovative, ambitious ways that we can ensure that SMEs are included in that global baseline and this transformation towards more sustainable business and economics, and not excluded. And I have to say, and I will finish with that I did not cite a couple of important jurisdictions in the region, but to say that Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and others are also considering a pathway towards the adoption, which for me is a very reassuring sign that we have probably found a nice, the right balance in terms of proportionality, and that I'm thrilled to see that whether that's in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, to see that regulators and governments are looking at those standards also as potentially a competitive advantage to attract foreign direct investment, for trade purposes as well, to meet with standards of other regions like European regions, for instance, and others. And so I will conclude by saying we are thrilled to be developing our work in a very dynamic ecosystem. It's a very collective work. We do not exist without you. We exist for you. And I want to express my gratitude for your audience, which in many ways has been and continues to support the consultations, the building of the global baseline, the dialogue with regulators to ensure that we end up with an appropriate language and disclosure system for your super important work. And with that, thank you for having listened to me. I wish you all a very fruitful conversation today. Thank you.